For more on the European stress test, we bring in Constance Hunter, Managing Director and Chief Economist at Aladdin Capital Management. Back in May, Constance predicted the debt problem would spread beyond Europe. Also with us, Marcus Mabry, a New York Times Associate National Editor. He was formerly International Business Editor there. He's been covering international markets for numerous publications since I was in high school. Thank you so much for joining us, guys.
Sure.
Let's start, Constance, with you, because I saw a note that you wrote before the stress tests were released, and you seemed optimistic that they would get, say, 10% of the banks. If they got 20 to fail, it would be even better, more stressful, obviously.
Yeah.
But we didn't really get there. Just about 7% dropped.
Yeah, and not just 7%, but that it was the amount of capital that needs to be raised is so small.
We ordered our banks to raise $74 billion, right? And they ordered their banks to raise $4.5 billion.
Exactly. Our stress tests were like when you go to the doctor and you have a stress test. And have you ever done this? You run at 90% of your heart rate and they hook all these things up and they see how your body reacts?
I recently did. They inject you with some radioactive chemicals. You sit in an X-ray machine for a while. It's not that fun.
Right, but you know the results, right? This was like they invited a bunch of people to take a stroll around Lake Como. So it's good because they let you know who the guest list was. They opened up the guest list.
Marcus, you know, a lot of people were predicting that this would happen. Could you have guessed that this was going to happen?
Sure,
it was like tailoring your exam so that most of the students passed.
Well, yeah, it was a question of how rigorous would these tests be, and it was the same with the U.S. test, you'll remember. And lots of folks, lots of investors, and particularly lots of shareholders thought that the U.S. tests actually weren't rigorous enough. In hindsight, in time, they actually turned out to be pretty accurate. The question is, you know, in worst case scenario, what happens to these banks? And the feeling is that they actually were not tough enough because the worst case scenario, for instance, any European sovereign debt, actually any European country actually going into default was not considered. That would have really been the worst case scenario. The European regulators who administered the test, their defense was that in fact that is unthinkable. That's not the worst case scenario. That's beyond the worst case scenario. So that's the problem. If that were to happen, say Greece were to default, these tests would be irrelevant.
What do you think, Constance? I mean, do they not take that into account because they have this $1 trillion fund ready to bail out Greece if it is close to a restructuring or a default?
Yeah, the thing is you have to consider what they release publicly and what they've been doing privately. So ever since they announced the stress tests, they've been looking under the hood of these banks. And they've been saying, all right, you have to do this and that to clean up. You've had some mergers with the Cajas in Spain. You've already had them addressing the problem. It's just a different approach. Their approach is more like, we're going to name some of these banks. We're going to publicly say that the worst case means Greece doesn't default. But when you talk privately with people in Europe and policymakers, they are worried that Greece might default in 2 years.
Look at the public information. I mean, they only give a haircut of Greek debt in the worst case scenario of 23%. Markets are already valuing Greek debt for less than that, right?
Exactly. Well,
Spanish debt, I think 12% and change. Is that a good worst case scenario?
It's not a good worst case scenario, but more importantly, they also only tested the tradable book. The part of the portfolio that's traded, they assumed everything else would be held to maturity. So you have to ask what part of the book was moved off the tradable account and into the hold to maturity category. And you're right, it doesn't account for what if Greece actually does restructure. Let's say if they restructure, you have to assume something like a 50% haircut. So it doesn't even come close to that.
And the whole point of this is to restore confidence. And so as we're all talking right now, you know, we're talking about, well, maybe there's still a lack of confidence in how stressful these tests actually were. It's not going to restore confidence in the long term. And in the short term, it looks okay. Today was a pretty decent day for them. But let's see what happens next week. Let's see what happens next month. If confidence is not restored, then you have a real kind of knock-on effect where the value of all this European sovereign debt that these banks hold will become less, and they will actually become under a more stressful situation. It's a very unvirtuous circle. And once you get into it, it's hard to get out of it.
Do you think, I mean, it's interesting to compare their stress test to ours, Constance, right? Because you point out after our stress test, we started a huge rally from March of 2009 until just a couple of months ago. Even with all of this capital raising, you saw these banks raising capital into climbing markets. It was pretty incredible.
I think that what's going to be interesting in Europe is to see how the individual central banks and regulatory supervisors deal with it. So if they start cracking down on the banks and you start seeing more banks raise capital than just the 7 that failed, then that's a good sign. The question is, who are they going to raise capital from, right? I mean, like you said, the U.S. banks banks got to raise in a rising market. If the Europeans don't get to do that, it's going to be very, very difficult to raise that capital.
Is there, Marcus, is there less concern, though, now about Europe than there was, say, 2 months ago? Because you had, for example, Spain saying, we're not worried about the recapitalization we have to do, and we're not going to take it from that $1 trillion European fund because we already have 12 billion euros of our own. I mean, do you see national governments sort of backing up their own banks here?
Well, the Europeans want us to think so, and they certainly are speaking, I think, with a great deal more confidence today than they were 2 months ago, when you had Greeks actually in the street kind of saying we won't take any more austerity. And it's a question, again, of convincing the rest of the world that confidence is well placed. I think the Europeans actually did a good job today of actually saying, no, this was a rigorous test. No, we're not going to give you all the guts that we found, but we believe us. It was really a tough test. We'll see if anyone believes them. I'm impressed with their ability to at least project confidence at this stage.
Just 30 seconds here. What do you think about the austerity measures? I thought it was interesting that Spain said today we'll see growth come back at some point, but of course they have taken on these huge austerity measures.
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, Europe is seeing growth stronger right now. They're on an upswing, while the U.S. is definitely looking in the abyss of a potential double dip and certainly a slowdown. So part of it depends on their exports. These are a lot of export-led economies, and how well they do will depend upon how well the rest of the world does.
All right, so we need to buy more European stuff to help them out. Marcus, thanks so much for joining us from the New York Times. Constance Hunter from Aladdin Capital Management.